Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Pierre Etienne, and Dr. Etienne has been in the life sciences, medical sciences area for a long time. After obtaining his medical degree in Belgium in 1972, Pierre Etienne moved to McGill University, where he did postgraduate work in neurochemistry. There, he directed a program on the biochemical, physiological, and neuropathological basis of Alzheimer's disease. After a brief passage in experimental medicine in Ciba-Geigy, now Novartis, he went back to McGill in 1987, dividing his time between Montreal Neurological Institute and Allen Memorial Institute. In 1989, he joined Pfizer as Director of Experimental Medicine, responsible for all phase 2A programs for US and Japan discovered compounds. In 1992, he became responsible for the entire early development program at Pfizer, and he was a team leader for the early development of several compounds such as ziprasidone and Adicept. In 2000, he became Vice President, Development Operations, Pfizer Global Research and Development, responsible for the execution of all Pfizer full development clinical programs worldwide. In 2003, he became CEO of Phage Tech, a privately held biotechnology company based in Montreal, Canada. Phage Tech exploited a proprietary platform based on phage bacterial intracellular interactions to research and develop new classes of synthetic antibiotics. Phage Tech later became Targenta Therapeutics, that went public on NASDAQ in the summer of 2008. In December 2009, he started a new life as a physician at the Douglas Institute at McGill. In July 2011, he was appointed director of the Clinical Research Division. He is now co-director of the Alzheimer's Disease Prevention Program, which is called STOP-AD. Welcome, Pierre.
Thank you.
So, given the COVID situation, I would like to start on your experience in early clinical research. There has been a lot in the airwaves about vaccines, some early results that appear to sound promising. Both of your previous employers, Pfizer and Novartis, have said that they have a moonshot in this area of vaccine development. And both, I believe, said they're going to get a vaccine out by this fall. From what I knew of pharmaceutical R&D, this timeline appear really different from what I have thought. Do you have a sense of what's happening?
Well, I read what's in the news like everybody else who's interested in the subject. And I'm impressed by the new varieties of vaccines that some companies intend to test. Moderna, for one, and Pfizer have, new approaches to vaccination. The idea being of exposing the subject to genetic material or genetic-like material that will trigger the fabrication, the manufacturing of versions of viruses or pieces of viruses that are not dangerous, but can trigger an antibody response that will protect against the real thing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these are wonderful ideas, and these are ideas that can be tested in at least to some degree in normal volunteers.
Right.
But and that's why the results in normal volunteers that have been reported lately with Moderna by Moderna
Yeah.
are intriguing and encouraging. I mean, phase one and working with normal volunteers is for a medical experimenter. I mean, the ideal setting because you
Yeah.
control most of the variables. Uh, and the idea here is to give the vaccine and see the reactions in normal volunteers, and that's what they saw. I mean, they saw that volunteers mounted an antibody response that was promising. But
Yeah.
that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, no. So I was just going to. So I was still confused about Moderna's results, and I haven't really looked at it deeply. But phase one, typically, as you said, normal volunteers, less than certain age, as my understanding, male, typically. And so, and I think of that 40 subjects in phase one, they have indicated that 8 have developed antibodies. So, uh, if this population is young and healthy, and the statistics I have seen in COVID-19 is that young and healthy people actually even turn asymptomatic to the disease. So, do these results actually indicate anything?
Well, Gil, I think you put your finger exactly on the problem with generalizing results obtained in phase one and extrapolating from healthy populations to populations that are most likely to suffer from a viral infection. And also, I mean, we have to ask ourselves whether the antibodies that are present in those volunteers would work against the real thing. I mean, the I think that it was said, at least by Moderna, that the concentration of antibodies in plasma in those volunteers was at least equal to that seen in patients who had recovered from a COVID infection.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that it's the same thing. I mean, the antibodies are very complex molecules, and it could be that some antibodies resemble the antibodies that would do the real work, and
Right.
but not sufficiently. And then there is the problem, as you pointed out, of who are the subjects, and how different are they from the victims, or
Hmm.
the possible victims, and they are enormously different. I mean, I think that 60% of the death or more are in elderly people over 75, and
Yeah.
it's very unusual, and I don't know whether anybody has done that before. Very unusual to test new medications or new agents in people that old. I mean, one could, I guess, do that progressively, but it
Right.
remains that it. And then there's the question of, uh, how how can you prove that the vaccine works?
Yeah.
And for that, you have to basically you have to treat somebody with a vaccine and then make that person sick
Right. Right.
with the real thing. And making that person sick is not that simple, because I mean, there's the amount of There is the amount of viral particles, the viral load, I mean, how it's administered and so forth. I mean, even if you have results that are promising after making some subjects who have been vaccinated sick with the virus, it doesn't mean that the vaccine is going to protect a population at large from the real thing.
Yeah.
And that's why, I mean, at some point, they have to do large trials. And by large, we're talking about thousands of subjects.
Yeah.
And the
So
reason, go ahead.
yeah. So the typical development process, as we have gone through in pharmaceutical companies,
Mhm.
um, takes a long time, right? You go through phase one, phase two A, phase two B, phase three,
Yeah,
and here we are running through that, or attempting to run through that fairly quickly. But the other issue, or from the data at least, the symptoms and the mortality are very different from certain populations. So clearly, age is there. Older people are more likely to be affected by it.
yeah.
Underlying diseases are there, like diabetes and hypertension. But it is also the case that African Americans and Asian Americans are more likely to be affected by it. And so I don't know if it is a genetic related issue, or why do you think that is the case?
Well, I don't know, and I don't think anybody does. But I think that the usual questions are, is this a lack of an overall how could I say, a poor state of health in a given population, or a less access to medical facilities,
Yeah,
or the presence of concurrent illnesses, or a genetic predisposition, or whatever. And a number of possibilities, a number of drivers, so to speak.
yeah,
And unless you do you study relatively large populations and model the contribution of those different drivers, you may not have a clear answer. And it could be that each of those drivers contribute to some degree. So
right.
it's a complex equation, and I don't think anybody has put it together.
Do you think there is a possibility of it's not a single organism? There might be multiple mutations or even multiple organisms, because the symptoms themselves seem highly varied in populations.
Well, you have the symptoms are probably the result of the interaction between the agent, and the recipient. So the virus, as we understand it, mutates. So it's not always the same thing. It could be working in conjunction with something else that we haven't identified,
Yeah,
and then the genetic receptacle, so to speak, is different, of course, from one person to another, from one group to another, from one race to another. All this is quite complicated.
right, right. So
But
in general, would you say, Pierre, then, um, although there is a lot of optimism around early data, it is still early days in terms of kind of proving something that is safe, and then the manufacturability of that is not shown either. So it has to be
well,
scaled up.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I'm less worried about the manufacturing issues, because pharmaceutical companies can mount tremendous, campaigns to
yeah,
build those things, and particularly if those viruses are basically man-made with pieces of DNA or RNA material and so forth, that can be scaled up very, very rapidly, as I understand it.
right.
But it remains that there will be large trials will be needed. I don't think that those vaccines will be given to the population before those large trials are completed. And those large trials are required because the probability of being infected naturally remains low. I mean, if you look at the numbers of people who have been exposed to the virus over the last 3 months in Western countries, I mean, all the numbers indicate that it's in the single-digit range, and it could be as low as 5%. Now, that means that if we were to test a vaccine tomorrow for the next 3 months, you know, we would be giving that vaccine. We would vaccinate a large number of people who are unlikely to get affected by the virus. And
that's sorry.
That's the problem. That's the problem with vaccination trials. It takes huge numbers to see small signals. And then you have another problem. Is that if you look at the success of vaccines for things as, I mean, benign as the flu or the regular flu, so to speak, in certain years, those successes are not very reassuring. I mean, they work in 60% of cases, or some 70% of cases. That leaves out 30% of the population. So, I mean, we would like to have a vaccine that works better than those vaccines that have been used year after year in the flu season.
And the reasoning that is typically used for that is that we didn't pick up the right mutation.
But you always one step behind, because the virus mutates ahead of you. So and the last another issue that I have to mention, and this has happened in the past with some vaccines, is that by the time we have enough vaccine, there won't be any sick patient left. So, and this has happened. This has happened to some pharmaceutical companies. I don't know the exact situation or the name of the company, but they were ready with the vaccine. There was nobody to vaccinate.
It is. So, as you mentioned, Sweden apparently had a strategy of getting herd immunity, as they called it. And the antibody testing there shows only about 5% of the population, as you mentioned.
In Sweden,
are infected, and so the idea of getting a large number of people infected and develop herd immunity seems to be a difficult thing to do, and this
natural herd immunity, it doesn't look like it's possible at all with the virus in its current form. But the idea is to achieve, so-called herd immunity with a vaccine. Not naturally, but almost naturally.
So I want to switch into another topic. So your research at the Douglas Institute now is in the area of Alzheimer's?
Yes. I mean, I do two things, actually. I have a support role in the prevention of Alzheimer's program. And I should mention that I'm no longer the co-director of that program. I resigned. I'm just one scientist in the program. And the program is going quite well. The only thing is that we can't see any of those volunteers in the cohort of people that we follow because of this annoying virus situation. So the program is pretty much interrupted right now. So I work on that. And I work and I support Professor Brunet, Alain Brunet, who is the inventor of the combination of propranolol plus repeated exposure to the trauma in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So my role there is to evaluate the participants and make sure that they don't have other conditions that would complicate the interpretation of results, or have a medical condition that would make the administration of propranolol uneasy or potentially dangerous.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
the PTSD area, what are the kind of the recent developments there? Are we getting a better view as to how how to treat it, how to possibly improve the situation?
I'm not a specialist of PTSD, and I don't. My understanding of PTSD is the result of my collaboration with Professor Brunet and his crew. But I think that the PTSD is a very complex thing, and even if we have an operational definition of PTSD that is satisfying for pharmaceutical companies and eventually for putting together a claim for a drug or a particular treatment, even though we have an operational definition of PTSD, and which is pretty arbitrary. PTSD ranges from feeling bad after having missed an exam to having almost auditory hallucinations of children crying before being shut down, as a scene from a war zone or something like that.
Right.
The approach of I call him Alain Brunet. The Brunet approach is innovative.
Yeah.
In that it combines a rather classical treatment, the re-exposition to an image or a memory of the traumatic experience, which in itself is beneficial in many people. It combines it with the administration of a beta blocker, propranolol, which was selected because it crosses the blood-brain barrier very well, better than others. And how can I say, dulls down the physical reaction associated with the PTSD experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's almost like, is it like almost conditioning the brain to accept?
I think I don't know exactly, but there are two things. First of all, basically listening like those participants do to somebody reading their description of the most traumatic experience they've had is already helping. It's as if you're sharing that experience, or it's as if you are pass it on to somebody else. And I mean, I don't have a better way of describing that, but that in itself is helpful. And then having that experience without the neurovegetative symptoms that you have normally, such as the tightness of the chest. I mean, the weakness in the limb, in the legs, the perspiration, the rapid breathing. I mean, all those things that are associated with a higher state of alertness, and not having that, as I said, dulls down the physical aspects of the traumatic memory, and it seems to have remarkable effects in his hands, and in the hands of others, because I think the method has been exported and replicated by many, including a large experiment in France where they treated victims of the shooting at the
Yeah.
in some bar, or Bataclan or whatever, something like that. There were, I think, a great many victims who were treated with that approach, and I think that they had positive results in at least two-third of the subjects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, back to the Alzheimer's disease
Uh,
area. What are the developments? Is Adicept still an available medication? I haven't really following.
it is
Following.
it
Yeah.
is and it's still used early in the disease. I mean, it depends about what you mean by early. I mean, it's a relative thing. I mean,
Yeah.
what Dr. Breitner, who set up the John Breitner, who set up the Center for Prevention of Alzheimer's Disease, was interesting in figuring out was the changes, the biochemical and basically multimodal changes that one can measure, one can observe and measure in people at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, but who are
Right.
asymptomatic. And you
Mm.
basically follow them year after year after year, and you measure as many things as you can without irritating them.
Yeah.
And those volunteers are, amazingly compliant and and how can I say, dedicated. But it remains that they have their own limits.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and so you measure
What is it?
everything. You measure
Yeah.
in the CSF. You measure as many proteins as you can.
Yeah.
You do structural and dynamic examinations of the brain, PET scans. I mean, everything you can throw at them, provided
Mhm.
you can do that repeatedly, and you try to understand what is the chain of reactions that lead to the emergence of symptoms.
Yeah. So it sounds to me that it's sort of a mechanistic view of the brain, meaning if we can understand what might be causing it mechanistically, that might indicate how we might be able to alleviate it. But I wanted also, is there a view? It's a disease that is sort of holistic to the brain, and and I'm just asking the question. I don't know much about it. In which case, the mechanistic things that we can see inside the brain may be less relevant.
Well, the fact that it's probably a very complex illness or a very complex disease with multifactorial disease, okay,
Yeah.
and including lifestyle, other conditions, and so forth and so forth. It remains that the progression of structural changes is very
Mm.
typical, replicable, and basically the same in everybody. And
Yeah.
it has been known for you know decades. The
Yeah.
stages of progression of the structural changes is very, very well understood. What's not understood was what precedes the events on
What
what
triggers?
triggers or the
Yeah.
reactions and the chain of reactions or the long chain of reactions perhaps that precedes those very replicable and well understood structural dispersion of structural changes. Uh,
Mm.
um,
So, I remember this was a long time ago. I remember, there was something about exercising the brain, and there was some data that showed that people who have interest in a lot of different things, music, literature, engineering, medicine, whatever you have, a lot of different things seem to have less of a likelihood of having AD, and related to that is people who are in professions like medicine or engineering, who seem to do very specific things for a very long time, seem to be more prone to the disease. Is that true,
I don't
or
know.
is it more?
I don't know
Yeah,
if it's true at all. I mean, intuitively, I'd be happy to learn, I'd be happy to be told that having many interests is a, you know, a protective measure, because I try to do that for myself.
yeah,
But
right.
I'm not sure at all that it's going to work. I mean, intuitively,
Mm,
perhaps. I mean, if you, well, suppose, for instance, that you learn something you've never learned. Now, I'm
yeah,
not talking about, going back and refreshing your knowledge of German, or doing some differential equations that you did when you were 19 or something like that. No, something you've never done. Like,
yeah,
I don't know, playing the bandolion, for instance, or so,
right.
that involves, movements from two hands, basically the building of all kinds of circuitry that will allow you to coordinate your left hand and your right hand. Well,
Yeah,
the same would apply, I presume, to dancing. If you're not a dancer, basically something to do something you've never done. I think, probably forces the brain to develop some circuitries to allow to make that possible. And
yeah.
these circuitries may be very useful when you lose the old ones. I just don't know.
Yeah, so it's sort of a
Yes.
redundancy, right? So if you get some redundant circuits, if one is going off, and obviously in engineering designs, that's always the case, right? Especially in autonomous vehicles or
Yeah.
something like that. Redundancy is a big aspect of it because we know things are going to break at some point, so there has to be something that can take over. But it seems like brain is a very elastic um, organ in the sense that it can do things that it's not trained to do fairly
Yeah.
quickly. um, when some parts of the brain is affected, it seems like other parts are sort of able to specialize in the same arena fairly quickly. So I wondered, but this is Alzheimer's itself is kind of a systemic issue, right? It's affecting almost the entire brain. It's not affecting parts of the
No,
brain, is it?
of course it's affecting the entire brain, but in a certain
Yeah.
sequence. And one of the parts that is damaged early are the temporal medial parts and the hippocampus formation. And there is a researcher in our institution, Veronique Bobot, who has
Mhm.
shown that navigation exercises in
Yeah.
people at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, people in their 50s or even their 60s and so forth, the navigation exercises actually result in in changes in the shape and volume of of that structure that is so vulnerable, the hippocampus. So it's quite interesting. I mean, one would be tempted to conclude that new circuitries have been built and have contributed to the
Mhm.
change in the shape of that region of the brain. I mean, something has changed because
Yeah.
the difference is you know sizable and measurable. It's impressive.
Yeah. So from a therapeutic perspective here, are there new drugs in the market?
No,
Okay. So it's
no.
pretty much what has been in existence for 20 years or
Well,
so.
yeah. I mean, a huge number of trials and drugs. The antibody approach, trying to remove amyloid, uh, have been. I don't know how many drugs have been thrown at that problem, but none of them so far has shown much promise. I mean, there is, I don't know if you've heard, but Biogen
Yeah.
has claimed that they have some interesting and reassuring results in their trial when reanalyzed. But I haven't looked at those results, but the colleagues I've talked to and so forth are very skeptical. And it's not at all certain that the FDA is that enthused by those results. We'll see.
Yeah. So, there has been a lot of development in the area of artificial
Yeah.
intelligence, as you know. I wondered if there is anything, in terms of early diagnostics, if you use MRI or some data from the brain that machines can recognize. I mean, for this to be useful, it has to be reasonably early, I would imagine, right? By the time it is sort of set, it's probably pretty easy to diagnose with existing
We are
symptoms.
very well equipped now, I would say, to predict that somebody is going to develop Alzheimer's disease at a time when they have virtually no symptoms to speak of. And
Yeah.
the predictive value increases with the number of modalities you follow. You can measure certain components of the cerebrospinal fluid after a spinal tap. That's very predictable by itself. You can measure the early deposition of amyloid in the brain. That's has some predictive value as well, but and you can see the changes in the reaction of the brain to certain tasks. And lately, you can also follow the circuitry of the brain, connectome analysis, as they call them, that basically measure the strengths and the speed of transfer of information from one region of the brain to another. And last but not least, neuropsychological tests have their own predictive value as well. So you put all that together, you can have a good estimate of the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease within the next 5 or 10 years. Yeah,
5 or 10 years. But if we don't really have therapeutics, what does does early diagnosis really help us?
It
in any
depends on
way?
whom you talk to. I mean, some people would
Right.
want to know, and some people don't want to know. And I don't think it would be wise to impose those tests on the population at large. It would cost a fortune to start with, and as you said, there's nothing you can do. Well, there's nothing we can do to change the course of the illness.
Yeah.
But there are certain things that people can do if they know. Some people want to know because they want change and make decisions about their own life. They want to retire early or not retire at all. Pass their money in trust to their children. Maybe learn to dance. Whatever. Everybody's different.
Yeah. So I want to come back to the clinical trials area one more time. So do you think the approaches that companies are taking, because of the requirements that we have to counteract the shock to the system, so to speak, the approaches they are taking that seem to be they're able to accelerate the R&D process timelines substantially, compared to the
In
status
Alzheimer's
quo.
disease?
No. Yeah. So I'm talking
COVID.
about COVID,
We're
or
back to COVID
COVID
now.
specific.
Okay.
Yeah. So they at least on the surface appear to accelerate these timelines substantially, either through better approaches, sequencing things differently. Do you think this will have an impact on pharma R&D is done in the future?
I think I think as far as if we talk about COVID, I mean, we talk about the difficulty
Yeah.
of going from normal volunteers and proving what they call target engagement. Basically, the drug does what it's supposed to do in normal volunteers, to vaccinating the population, a large population. There will be, I think, that there might be some innovation around the transition from normal volunteers to the population at large, especially if the calculation of risk benefits is done correctly.
Yeah.
If there is a way of showing that vaccinating a large segment of the population without having the traditional results to get there, vaccinating that large segment of the population in that situation will save a great deal more lives than following the status quo. We might be able to accelerate the availability of vaccines. It's
Yeah.
possible. I think that this is a crisis, but this is a crisis that may trigger all kinds of innovations, particularly around the transition I'm trying to describe.
Yeah. Yeah. The complication in COVID, though, is that the mortality is significantly higher in a population,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
say,
yeah.
about
But
50.
there as well, I mean, the innovation might be to include
Yeah.
in normal volunteers people who are much older, normal
Right.
elderly
Right.
type people. I read that the number of people interested in volunteering to receive the this inoculation with the virus after being vaccinated is pretty high. Will they be allowed to participate in such trials? I don't know, but that will be a very interesting terrain to perhaps develop new approaches and new transitions from normal volunteers to elderly volunteers to the population at large.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, this almost like a
Yeah,
phase
yeah, 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 yeah.
1B where, yeah. So rather than subjects, what you have there is sort of a typical cross section that you anticipate of the
Yeah.
population.
I mean, typically,
Yeah.
if you look at Ebola or other, I mean, I'm not saying Ebola is a typical disease, but as far as vaccination is concerned, I mean, the idea is to increase, is to choose a population that is at higher risk of being exposed to the virus. And in our case, it would be, medical personnel and elderly people living in nursing
Yeah.
homes. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. There, there's a lot of speculation here that there could be a second wave of
yes,
COVID in the fall. And what is
I'm
your
just, I
expectation?
would
So
just repeat what I
that
heard from
yeah,
specialists,
yeah,
and I think that
yeah,
many of them are very concerned about that, and it's largely based on the analysis of epidemics caused by viruses of the same type. So
mhm.
if their predictions are correct, we should have another wave in autumn.
Yeah. It's the other complication there obviously is during the influenza season, there is
Yeah,
40,000 deaths in the U.S. By
yeah,
simple flu. And because the symptoms are so much alike between COVID and regular flu, and this is going to probably triple that number if there isn't any vaccine, or if we essentially handle it the same way as we did this time. So do you see a problem with, these two things happening at the same time, and how that might create a problem for the healthcare
Well,
system?
sure. I mean, this is what experts say. Um, what is,
Yeah.
as I understand it, what's particular about this virus is the trans in the course of the illness is the transition from a flu-like situation into an
Mhm.
acute respiratory distress syndrome situation, which is associated with an inflammatory response, an excessive inflammatory response in the lungs, and perhaps other tissues as well.
Yeah.
And if I mean, there will be a number of treatments, experimental treatments that will be available. There will be antiviral drugs of classical ones, new ones, and there will be, I think, treatments of the this inflammatory storm that is perhaps even at least as important as the antiviral per se. Now,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Do you see? Yeah. Go
So
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
I don't know what is the proportion or the proportion of patients with the flu who develop an ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, but it's probably much
Yeah.
lower than with COVID.
Right. Right. And of course, by the time we get it back, it could be
Yeah, but
mutated
the
already.
nice thing
So,
about the
so
component of treatment
yeah.
that addresses the inflammatory syndrome is that it's independent of the cause to some extent. So an
Okay.
ARDS would be treated, with probably the same cocktail of drugs, regardless of the original cause, of the primary cause. Yes.
Right. Do you see any value in some of these preventative medications that that have been talked
Like
about? Do you see any value for large
like
populations to take
hydroxychloroquine.
those?
Yeah,
Yeah, something
hydroxychloroquine
like that.
is an interesting drug. I mean, I know our president takes it as a preventive measure, much to uh, the chagrin of some of his scientific advisors. But hydroxychloroquine is also an anti-inflammatory drug. Uh,
Hmm.
I don't know. It you know it has been tested in, as I understand it, in patients who were already quite sick, and there
Hmm.
it doesn't show much of a therapeutic signal at all. But
Right.
is it possible
Right.
that it might have uh, preventive efficacy? I just don't know. The problem with giving it as a prevention drug, is that it's not an innocuous drug and has cardiac side effects. So yeah,
There's a
QT prolongation and
QT
the risk of
elongation. Yeah. Yeah.
what they call torsade, which is basically an erratic beating of the heart leading to heart failure. And that's a very
Yeah.
dangerous situation, very dangerous condition, of course. And uh, that has to be calculated. I mean, even right now, it looks as if the risk benefit is not reassuring. Well, certainly not convincing.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, is it possible that a lower dose of the drug with cardiac monitoring might help, might have some preventive value? I just don't know.
Yeah, that seems like especially for the younger population, that
Hmm.
seems like a tough path. If you have an 80, only about a 20% chance of getting severe symptoms, uh, taking something preventatively that has other potentially long-term issues, seem like a risk reward that is tough to
It
take.
has to be calculated. We just don't know. We probably don't know enough to condemn the drug as having no
Yeah,
value whatsoever as a preventive agent. But we don't have any
right.
data to support the
Yeah,
notion that it should be taken because it's pretty safe and might do something good. So we are in a fog.
right, right, right. Yeah, I remember it being something that was advised for people to take when they travel to Africa or India where there
Yeah.
is high incidence of malaria from the US. I don't know if that is still advised or not. But when I was going to India in the 80s and 90s, I was advised to take it, even though the area I was
And
going
it
to
was the
didn't
same
have
for
much
me.
malaria at all.
Yeah. In the
Yeah,
90s, traveling to India for, I mean, I remember it was in 1996, I think, that I first traveled to India for Pfizer. And I had to go through
yeah,
the some tropical disease clinic. And I took
right.
some drug in advance. I can't remember, a couple of weeks in advance of the departure time. And I took some, and I kept on taking it while I was there. And I just don't remember whether it was hydroxychloroquine.
Yeah, yeah. I remember the name. It was chloroquine. I don't know if it was hydroxychloroquine, but
Yeah.
chloroquine
Well,
is what I remember.
yeah.
Yeah. So just to conclude on this here, what is your, if you think about it most optimistically, from a pharmaceutical perspective, what are your kind of optimistic views? And I want to touch on both COVID as well as AD, and kind of the brain related, aging related brain diseases in general. What would you say, optimistically,
Well,
how we are
on the
progressing in
COVID
both
front, I
dimensions?
think I'm very optimistic. I think that
Yeah,
cocktails of medications you know, will be found, and they will have an antiviral component and an anti-inflammatory component. Uh, and I'm pretty sure, not pretty sure, but I'm optimistic that a decent vaccine
yeah,
will be available for large-scale testing towards the end of this year. Now, whether the
mm,
vaccine will be made available to the population at large around that time, in other words, without waiting for the results of the large-scale trials, I just don't know. Probably not. Most of the experts
mm,
I read say, it will take a year or a year and a half before the large scale trials are completed, and we can release the vaccine for the population
yeah,
at large. But this being made,
yeah,
these are still good news. Okay, so I'm optimistic about COVID. Now
yeah,
on the Alzheimer front, uh, it's it's a little more complicated. A little more complicated.
mm,
We do not have we do not have an understanding of the uh, chain of biochemical changes leading to irreversible structural changes. We just don't.
right,
It's not clear.
yeah,
Uh, when it's clear, I think, you know, um, it may very well be possible that we can interfere or block an element of that change, so that the progression of the disease stops in its tracks. But we understand COVID so much better. It's a small thing,
Right.
but we understand it well. It's just amazing the amount of information that has been gathered on that virus in such a small time.
Yeah, but that has always been the case, right? We are pretty good at external threats to the human body, but it's all the autoimmune issues that we haven't been able to solve.
Well, at least we are good at certain things.
So, yeah. Excellent. So I really appreciate Pierre taking the time to talk with me today, and keep safe. Hopefully, we'll get over
all right, Gil. Well,
this
same to you
problem
and your
very
family.
soon.
Take care. Bye.